See why I mean it's over, it's a multi-generational story. So at that time, the verse says in chapter 38, Judah goes away from his brothers, goes and meets a man, Adulami, whatever that means. The name is Chira. He meets a friend. It's a very strange verse because really, who cares about he made friends? This guy does not take it. It's not an important part of the story, but he makes a friend. Okay. When he's over there, he sees the daughter of a Canaanite man, and the guy's name was Shua. He marries his daughter. He has 3 sons. Okay. Son has to get married, right? You see, this can't be in the middle of the story of Joseph, right? The story of Joseph, between Joseph's sale and the continuation of the story. It's already a full generation. The child grew up. So you have to marry off the son. Okay, so what do you do? So he found a wife named Tamar. Tamar married the first one, but the first one did evil in the eyes of God, and he died. Okay, so what do you do if a woman is widowed? In the Torah, there's this there is this notion that if somebody dies without sons, then the brother is supposed to marry the widow. And then the first child that will be born will be considered the son of the deceased brother. In other words, will have the name of the deceased brother. It's called Yibum. And that happens in Deuteronomy. It's in the Torah, but in the Torah, it's a little bit different than the way it was before the Torah was given. Once the Torah was given, it's specifically the brother. But you'll see in the story, in that culture, it was the family member. In any case, okay, so first one's son dies. Second son should marry Tamar. That's what happens. The problem is the second one also dies. He also sins. So he also dies. So now we have the third one. We have third son, Shelah. Judah doesn't want to give Shelah to Tamar. He's afraid that this woman is bad luck. In other words, instead of saying, well, maybe my son did something wrong, the Torah says his sons did the evil in the eyes of God. He thinks it's her. So he doesn't want to give Shelah. So instead of telling her, I'm not giving you Shelah, he says, you know what? Why don't you wait? My son is still young. Why don't you go back to your father's home, remain as a widow, don't marry anybody else, stick around, and eventually my son will grow up and he'll marry you. And then she realizes after her son grows up, she realizes that it's not really happening. So she has to come up with an alternative plan. What's the alternative plan? The Torah says at that point, Judah's wife dies. Third person that died in the family. Strange story, but we'll get back to that also maybe. And then Judah goes with his friend and he's going to shear the wool. Okay, so she says, now is my time. She disguises herself as a harlot, has relations with Judah. But Judah doesn't have any payments because he doesn't have any sheep to pay because he's on the road. So she says, give me security. Give me your signet, give me your staff, and give me your belt. Fine. So he does that. The next day he sends his friend to go find the harlot, give her the payment and take the signs. Guys, the harlot's gone. No one ever heard of a harlot here. 3 months later, she is pregnant. Judah's told your daughter-in-law became pregnant. Okay, that's a terrible thing because she legally is sort of still wed to the family, waiting for Shelah. So he says, okay, that's adultery. You have to kill her. You have to burn her. So she sends to Judah and she says, they're taking her to be killed. She sends him the signs and she says, oh, by the way, that the father is the person who these belong to. And Judah sees that. Now, she doesn't want to accuse him in public. She doesn't want to embarrass him. That's the sage's reading of the story. So she says, I became pregnant to the person who owns these. Judah takes responsibility, says, Tzadkami Meni, she's more righteous than me. And two opinions, whether he ceased, he didn't, in other words, either married her or he didn't. There's two opinions. Then she becomes pregnant. She has twins. And there's this whole description of the birth of the twins. And the bottom line is amongst these twins is a guy named Peretz, who later we know becomes the ancestor of King David. And then we go back to Joseph. That's the story. Now, the Torah, by the way, is fascinated with twins. Whenever there's twins in the story, in the Torah gets carried away. This is an example. So there's a lot of symbolism in the story of how these twins are described, but that's a little bit too far in the story. We're not there yet. So we'll get to there when we get there. So that's the big picture. again, what is the connection between this story and the sale of Joseph? So that was the first question that we started addressing last week. And we said the beginning could be that Vayered Yehuda descends. Rashi says, let's start with Rashi, it's a good place to start. Rashi says, Judah descends means the brothers, they depose him of his greatness. He's considered the leader. Depose him of his greatness. Why? Because they realize that the pain they caused their father. And they realize the pain they caused their father, and they regret, and they turn to Judah and they say, it was your idea to sell Joseph. And if you would tell us not to, we would not. So Judah says, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. I'm going. And he goes and he goes to start a family. Now, there's a lot of tragedy in the family, in his own personal family. 2 of his sons die. His wife dies over time. And but then it's also a hopeful story in the sense that Judah's descendants, the dynasty that will emerge in the Jewish people, the monarchy, the dynasty of monarchy that will descend from the Jewish people that would really represent Judah's leadership and the people, happens through this story, which is also strange because it looks like a story which is completely immoral, at least on the surface. At least he thought he's doing something immoral. In reality, he was doing something. It was an act that was supposed to happen because someone in the family was supposed to marry Tamar, right? But his intention was negative. And here you have the redemption, or King David, happens through a story that on the surface, at least the intention of the players, at least Judah, was negative. So it's this negative story. He descends. It starts with a descent. Yehuda descended from his brothers. Same word, we discussed this last time, same word, Joseph descends. So we certainly have a descent here. On the other hand, the result is redemption. Redemption of the Jewish people hundreds of years later, in the times of King David, 600 years later, in the times of King David. But also, if you really want to look even broader, redemption of the world, the universal redemption, which we believe will happen in the future because the Messiah is the descendant of King David, and King David is a descendant of Peretz. So all this happens from this descent. So that is another story. Now, what is the connection between this story and the sale of Joseph? It didn't have to be placed right here, especially as I mentioned before. Rashi says the story began after the sale of Joseph. Other commentaries, the Even Ezra says it cannot be. He proves that it's not possible. It had to have started earlier. It was placed here to make the point, to make the similarity, to draw the similarity. So there has to be similarity, contrasting points between this story and the story of Joseph. The Torah wants you to think about both these stories together to learn something, to glean some meaning. And therefore, over the past 2,000 years or 3,000 years, everybody's offering their own comments, some negative, some positive. There's a lot to say. Just on a basic surface level, this is a very similar story that happens to Joseph and happens to Judah. In other words, both the stories, there's a descent. Here it says Judah went down actively. He went, and then the next chapter, chapter 39, we discussed this last week as well. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. In other words, also the same route, Huran, he was brought down. Same route. Here, Judah did it actively by Yered. He acted, he went down, he descended. And Judah was brought down, but so he was acted upon because he was sold. It was against his will. But the bottom line, it's the same word. So in other words, you could think about this as the same pattern happens twice. What's the pattern? The pattern is that there's a descent, and there's tragedy, and there's pain. But ultimately, the pain will lead to redemption. That's the theme of both those stories, because that's the story of Judah. It's also the story of Joseph. What's the story of Joseph? For many years, he's enslaved and even imprisoned. And for 13 years, he's enslaved and imprisoned. But then that slavery actually leads him to a point of kingship and ultimately redeems the Egyptian economy and redeems his family. Later, that leads to the slavery of Egypt and then the Exodus. But you could talk about it depending where you want to put the focus. You could focus the story, Joseph himself, Joseph's own life. The descent actually leads to leadership, leads to redemption for himself and for his family. And that's the story of Judah. So it's showing you the pattern, the same pattern that what looks like a descent is in fact an area that will actually ultimately lead to greater growth and ultimately to redemption. So that's a very Jewish optimistic story. And the Torah could be putting these two stories together. The big point is because the same pattern occurs in both these stories. The only difference is that Judah, a lot of it is his own choice, right? That's why the beginning of the chapter 38 is Judah went down, right? So he's taking the action. With Joseph, it was against his will, right? So events happened to him. But the bottom line is that pattern, that the descent actually leads to an ascent and to redemption, that is similar in both those stories. So that's why you understand why it's both here. Now, there's a lot of differences between the stories, and it could be the Torah wants to highlight the differences as well. So once we get into the details, we could talk about the differences between the stories. But the big idea, the same thing that happens to Judah happens to Joseph in some sense. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. If, as we've seen before, if the fix is offered at the time of the problem, whether it be
Genesis, the seed.
Yeah. So whether it be Noah's Ark, or whether it be Judah, or whether Judah and the juxtaposition of Judah and Joseph, are we to assume that the destiny is without free choice, that we've had no control of this?
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
Destined?
That's a very good question. We have to believe in free choice, because free choice is a principle of faith. We also have to believe what Maimonides says, that the Torah promises us that eventually people are going to make the right choice and return. That's what Maimonides says, based on the verses that say in Deuteronomy, that says that Hashem ultimately, ultimately God will redeem your captive and bring you back to Israel. It says Maimonides, we have a divine promise. God promised, Torah promised that ultimately people are going to repent and return to God. So ultimately, people will make the right choice. So how do I square both those concepts? How do I say that we have free choice, but the result is we know the result is going to happen? Okay, so I think the easiest answer is we know the result is going to happen. We don't know how long it's going to take. Okay, so for example, the Medrash says that when the Jewish people left Egypt and they crossed and they were about to cross and they crossed the Red Sea and they sang the song of the crossing of the Red Sea, at that point, it was supposed to be the Messianic era. In other words, they were supposed to enter Israel, final redemption. And that's why in the song they say, we're going to cross over, build the temple, Hashem yimloch la'olam va'ed, God will reign forever, which is later the verses that the prophets say, Vayomahu, and that day, in the end of time, God will rule forever. We already sang it when we crossed the sea. Says Rashi, quotes the Medrash, it had the people not sinned in the desert in that few weeks, interim time between the crossing of the sea and the entering of, and what was supposed to be the entering of the land of Israel, they would have entered the land of Israel immediately, and the world reaches redemption. But they sinned because we have free choice. So what happens? So first of all, the entry of Israel was delayed 40 years. Even that entry was not a complete entry. We didn't eradicate. We didn't eradicate the enemy. We had our own problems. We didn't eradicate the negativity within ourselves. We served idols. So it was a completely different path, much longer path. And what was supposed to take what could have taken a few weeks, later takes a few thousand years. Okay, that's a result of free choice. But ultimately, will we reach redemption? The answer is yes. So the answer is the same thing with Judah and Joseph. Jacob has to get to Egypt. How will it be? The Jewish people have to go to Egypt, because that was the divine plan told to Abraham. How would it have become? The Medrash says that God does a favor to Joseph, to Jacob. Jacob, he says, should have been led to Egypt in chains as a captive. But God did a miracle. God orchestrated, or God did kindness, that he was brought down to Egypt to come visit his son, who was the leader of Egypt. Right. So in other words, how we get to Egypt, we don't know. It happened through the sin of the brothers selling Joseph. In their mind, that was a bad choice, but that had certain positives for their father. Now, when their father came, had the brothers not sold Joseph, would the Jews not end up in Egypt? They would end up in Egypt, but it would happen in a different way. So in other words, the result is ordained in a way, but how long it will take and what the process is also, it's its own story. So there are two tracks that are going to happen together. And this story itself, both these stories, I think both Judah and Joseph play on this theme, that the players are acting their own free choice, but they're actually playing out a bigger story that they're not aware of.
So this is in essence, this is a pass-fail test where eventually everybody passes.
Eventually, everybody passes. It's not the same form of pass because you understand that the
It may
experience.
be your descendants that pass, not you.
The descendant pass too, but also the experience is much more deep because when you read the story, it seems like, oh, the Jews should have just gone in. But the Hasidic interpretation is, had we gone in, if a few weeks after the Exodus, so there wouldn't be 4,000 years of pain of Jewish history, but there wouldn't be 4,000 years of growth, right? So it's not the same exact. They're different tracks, and every track has an advantage and a disadvantage. So we're not exactly getting to the same point. We're getting to the same redemption. The question is what that redemption looks like, and that itself, there's two paths how that redemption would look like.
But your implication is that the bad choice is sometimes the better choice because it leads to more growth.
What am I going to do? I'm biased. That's the Hasidic perspective. The Hasidic perspective refuses to see only negative. Even in the process of pain and suffering, it has to look for the positive. And it's not just Hasidic. Hasidic movement emphasizes this, but it's built into Judaism. It's built into Judaism itself, if you know where to look. Right now we're in the 3 weeks, the period of mourning of the destruction of the temple. So you have this this tradition in the Talmud that this Jew was walking down the street on the 9th was in his field, the 9th of Av, the day of the destruction of the temple, that the first original year, and he hears the cow is making noises. So he asks the Arab, "What's going on?" And the Arab says, "You know why? Because the thing was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. You sensed it. That even the animal could feel in the ear that the temple was destroyed." And then the animal starts making more noise. So he says, "What happened?" So he says, "Oh, the Redeemer has been born on the day of destruction." Right? Again, talking about even before the exile. So in Judaism itself, we refuse to see just the destruction. We would see the destruction as the beginning of the next phase. And we could bring many other examples for that. But that's the Hasidic view, and the Hasidic view will tell you that that's the Jewish view. So I apologize for people who are looking for the sad story and the pessimism. I apologize. We don't go. Ultimately the negative is there's also positivity in the negativity. And like I said, both these stories are very clear examples where there's two things playing out. There's the free choice playing out. Judah makes his choice, and many of them are negative choices, but he's part of a larger story that sometimes he doesn't know. You don't even have to say God knows. Tamar knows, right? It's very clear that there's two players here, and the woman knows what's happening and knows that what this act is actually a holy act and a positive act. Judah himself is making a negative choice, but ultimately that's advancing a positive choice. And that's how we get result is intact, not exactly the same result. In other words, like I said, on one hand, we say we're going to reach redemption. There's no question about it. The question is, it will take a few weeks or 4,000 years or 3,000 years. The bottom line is whether the amount of time it takes is going to affect what that redemption looks like. So it's not just we're going to get to the ice cream store. The question is, it will take us a half an hour or 5 hours. No, the experience that you're going to get to, it's both redemption, but the experience that you're going to get to is going to look different. But we know there'll be redemption. So that's how we're doing both of these together. Okay, another way of thinking about why these stories are placed together. So we talked about the similarity. The pattern is the same. A descent is actually a springboard for ascent, which is a nice Hasidic idea. True about everybody's life as well. The challenges in everybody's life. For our pulpit rabbi, I could talk about this for a whole Yom Kippur. Unfortunately, I'm not, so you have to hear me talking about it on Sunday morning on a thing. But now let's talk about the differences. Maybe, when you put two things together, sometimes it's to contrast. And so how they're different. How are they different? And in some ways, you could say that the Torah is putting them together to show the differences of these stories. And what is what is more clearest difference? The clearest difference would be that when it comes to the moral challenge, of Judah and Joseph, Judah fails and Joseph passes the test. right? The test of seduction and adultery. Because what happens is it's not really adultery because they weren't married, but the test of lust. Okay, so Judah follows the harlot. It happens to be his daughter-in-law, and it's a mitzvah if he did it with the proper intention. In other words, he should have married her. He didn't want to. But in his mind, he follows the harlot. Meanwhile, later we're going to see the story of Joseph once he's taken captive and he's sold to Potiphar. There's a whole story in the Torah how Potiphar's wife wants to seduce him. And of course, the balance of power there is she has all the power, he has no power. And therefore, then she accuses him when she realizes that he's not going to succumb. She accuses him of trying to rape her. And the husband, his master, has no choice but to believe he doesn't believe his wife. He would believe his wife, he would kill Joseph. He knows his wife is making up a story, but he has no choice. So then he puts him in prison, and he's in prison for many, many years because of this claim. But this claim is really as a result of his refusal to be seduced. So here you have the similar story, and then you have a scene of seduction, and we have Judah fails and Joseph passes. Okay, so it's highlighting the moral superiority of Joseph over Judah. Now, it's not a surprise because we know that Judah is the one who was instrumental in the sale of Joseph. Now, the sale of Joseph it's also a twist because the sale of Joseph was really saving him from so many layers. Sale of Joseph was saving him from what they thought was his death because he was in a pit, he would have died. They didn't realize, so they thought they're selling him from death. They didn't realize that the sale is actually condemning him because Reuven wanted to save him from the pit, right? So the layers of I don't want to say, I don't know what I'm saying. There's multi-layers of people acting one intention, and the result was completely inconsistent with what their intention was. So they sell him, they think they're saving him, really they're not, etc. So the bottom line is, but what's relevant for us is, so Judah himself is the person who was instrumental in the sale of Joseph. So that would be a moral failing. So if I asked you, who's going to succumb? You never read the Genesis chapter 39 or 38, and I said, who's going to succumb to the temptation? Is it going to be Judah or is it going to be Joseph? Who's going to succumb? You're going to tell me, of course, Judah would succumb, and you're right. Okay, fine. But what's really happening here? Fine. So what are we saying? Judah's a bad guy. That's why we're writing this whole story. Judah's a bad guy. And if he's so terrible, then why? If the point is to show that he succumbs and he succumbs to his temptation, so why is the result of this union ultimately going to be so great? Because again, it doesn't emphasize it here, but it tells you who Peretz is, tells you who the child is. And later we know in the Torah who Peretz becomes, the ancestor of King David, and it's highlighted in the book of Ruth also. So the point, by the way, the book of Ruth is the same story. A relationship that was less than moral perhaps becomes the ancestor of King David, but that's another story. But the point here is, so what are we saying? Judah's a bad guy. Is that what that's what we got together here on Sunday morning to bash Judah? And that's what the Torah is trying to do, dedicate the entire chapter 38 to tell you Judah sold his brother, and then also he succumbed to temptation. Is that what we're trying to do? So the commentaries say, no, missed the whole point. There's two characters. There's two prototypes of characters in Jewish thought. One is the righteous, the person who doesn't sin. The other person is the Baal Teshuvah, the person who is tempted to sin and sometimes sins, but ultimately overcomes his temptation and repents. And the question becomes, who was greater? And there's not a simple answer to that question, who was greater. But what we're trying to say is, if Joseph, in the context of this story, Joseph is the person who did nothing wrong. In the context of this story, you can go and say, why did he harass his brothers? He was a young lad when he harassed his brothers. But in the story, clearly, Joseph has the moral upper hand. There's no clear failing that you could say moral failing in his adulthood. After the Torah says he's a na'ar, he's a young lad. But in his adulthood, there's no clear moral failing of Joseph. So Joseph would be classified as, Maimonides refers to him as the Chassid HaMa'ula, the perfect, righteous Chassid, the pious. Other people say tzaddik. In other words, you can name it different names. By the way, in the Zohar, in Jewish literature, the only character of the Bible that people refer to as Joseph the tzaddik, Joseph the righteous. No one else. You don't say Abraham the tzaddik, but Joseph is Joseph HaTzaddik. That's the way he's referred to in Jewish literature. Joseph the righteous. Why do we refer to him as righteous? So people say because of this story. Think about the circumstances. He's a slave. He's in a foreign land. Nobody would have known. and he doesn't succumb to temptation, that's righteous. So that's Judah. That's Joseph, the guy who doesn't succumb. And then you have Judah. Judah succumbs right away, very easy. He walks by, sees a harlot, boom. But what's the story? The story is the fact that Judah ultimately overcomes his temptation. In other words, his attitude, his selfish attitude. And it starts in this story when she does not say, you are the father of the infant, or of the infant. They know is twins at that point, but he takes the responsibility. And then what we're trying to say is, ultimately, if you continue reading the story, you see Judah's transformation from somebody who sells Joseph and deals with a cover-up and goes away from his brothers and succumbs to temptation. He's the one that ultimately takes responsibility for his family and takes responsibility for Benjamin. And on his own, he could have been quiet. Very easy for him to just look the other way. Tamar would be killed. He would have no problem. Nobody would know. Nobody would have known that he did something less than moral. But the transformation of Judah starts here and continues in the rest of the story. And now maybe the Torah is highlighting that it's not so simple. Talking about the judgment, who's greater? In the final analysis, who's greater, the person who didn't sin or the person who sinned and then has to transform himself and then does transform himself? And that's the two stories being put next to each other, not necessarily taking a stand on who's greater. By the way, it could be the Torah is taking a stand who's greater, because ultimately we know that in the idea of leadership in the family, it's Judah.
Jacob decides who's greater on his deathbed.
Jacob decides who's greater on his deathbed, but Jacob could be responding to the stories or the personalities, because that's sort of the culmination. In other words, this happened after Jacob. This happens after. What about Judah is going to be that which makes him entitled to leadership? Think about the story. So Judah. So you're right that Jacob speaks about this on his deathbed, and he alludes to it. But he alludes to it. But why? Because he likes him better. Why? So something about his character. So what's his character? What is it? Could you say that he doesn't sin? You can't say it about Judah. You can't say it about King David. You talk about King David. You can't say it about King David. The person, he sins also succumbs with Bathsheba. On the other hand, talk about people who don't sin. Joseph. And who was the first king of the Jewish people? The first king of the Jewish people is Saul. And Saul later gets the bad spirit and he gets a little depressed. But in the beginning, he's flawless, morally flawless. And he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which is related to Joseph, because Joseph and Benjamin are same mother. So Benjamin is so Saul is the tzaddik. He's the righteous guy. There's nothing. David is flawed. Judah is flawed. So who's the leader? Who's the leader? So what is the message? What is the messaging here of the story? So who's the leader? The leader is not the person who does not sin, but the person who ultimately could take responsibility and correct and transform, because ultimately that would put the person ahead of the game. So that could be part of the story. And some people say that's actually the purpose of the story, because if you think about it, what do we want to get to? What is the book of Genesis trying to achieve? So there is the narrative, how the origin story, how we became a people. So we have to have our family, and we have to know how we got to Egypt. So we get to the book of Exodus, which would tell you how we left Egypt and become a people. But you have to get us to Egypt before we can leave Egypt. So that's the purpose of the book of Genesis on the surface. But there's also a deeper story, because in the book of Genesis, it's also telling you that God is selecting the chosen people, quote unquote. God is selecting the people who are going to carry the legacy of monotheism. And that's why in every story, that's the tension, right? With Abraham, that's the tension. That's the subplot. The tension between Ishmael and Isaac, between Isaac and Jacob. That's the tension that drives the story forward. Who is going to be chosen to be part of the bearer of the legacy of Abraham? Now that question has been solved once you come to Jacob, because it's Jacob's entire family. Now what's the tension? The tension could be who's going to lead this family. And that's the sub-story. Of course, we have the general story, how we got to Egypt. But then it's also a question of the story has to also inform us and give us the indicators of who's going to become the leader and why they will become the leader. And some people would say that proof to this theory is because right at the end, right before the story of the brothers of Joseph, if you remember in chapter 36, we talk about the kings that ruled in the land of Edom, Esav's kings. Then we go into Joseph and his brothers. Okay, some people would say chapter 36 is who's Esav kings. Chapter 37, etc., to the end of the story, is who's going to be the kings and descendants of Jacob. And then the story of Judah and the story of Joseph sort of plays out. Let's see who's going to become the king. And right away you get to Joseph's dreams. And Joseph thinks that he's going to rule, and he is going to rule in the beginning, just like Saul rules before David. But the point here is that you would be mistaken, you would be forgiven to think that Joseph should be the one to rule. Because look at his moral record. His moral record is perfect, certainly in comparison to Judah, certainly in the same story, the story of temptation. And what happens? And no, maybe the story is telling you that the story that the greatness of a king, the greatness of a leader, is not somebody who doesn't sin. In fact, somebody who's almost perfect and doesn't have to struggle with temptation, when they are challenged, they have no experience in dealing with challenge. So when Saul, who's always a person in his life, he was a good kid. In other words, he didn't have to deal with challenges, internal challenges. Then when he gets this jealousy of David, he doesn't know what to do. He can't handle it. As opposed to somebody that in their history, in their family, in the legends of their family is very clear that the patriarch is somebody who sins all the time, and yet takes responsibility, transforms, grows. That's the origin story. That's the ethos. That's the person we're selecting. So that could be another reason of why what the story is doing here, not only to show that what happens to Joseph happens to Judah in a very similar way, but and highlighting the similarities, but you can also say that it's highlighting the differences. And we're talking about who is more, or the two paths. Which path is more, the path that is more righteous, or the path that is the challenged person who's challenged and yet overcomes the challenge. And it seems that Jewish history, is going to come down on the side of Judah and say, Judah, not because he didn't sin. The qualification of a leader, and certainly leader of the people, is not someone who doesn't sin or is not challenged. Qualification is somebody who could fall, but then could take responsibility even when it's easy to look the other way. And Judah is the master of looking the other way. He looks, they go eat lunch when the brother's in the pit. Here, it was relatively easy not to say anything. And yet the transformation begins in this story. Now, I'm going to skip a little of the story, and I want to go straight to the end, to the birth of the two sons, because the birth of the two sons, at least from the mystical perspective, highlights the same theme. So I want to just read that, and then we'll go back, because that's going to tie into what we're saying. So I'm just going to share it on the screen. Genesis chapter 38. Also, a very weird story that I say it's weird because nobody knows why this is important. In other words, the obsession with the details of the birth of the twins. Like, who cares? Twins were born. You're going to see this. And this is also a strange story. And Bob is going to tell me that this is impossible, but that's another story. Okay. So what happens after the whole story? Okay, we'll read a little of the drama. So Judah, read a little drama. So let's start with 20, just to get some drama. Chapter 38, verse 20 in the Art Scroll. It's on page 38 in the Art Scroll, page 211. So Judah sent a kid by the hand of his Adulamite friend. Remember, he met a friend. A friend that helped him do everything, including pay the harlots. In any case, to take the pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her. So he asked the people of the place, saying, "Where's the harlot who was at the crossroads on the way?" And they said, "No harlot was here." So he returned to Judah, and he said, "I have not found her." And the people of the place also said, "No harlot was here." So Judah said, "Let her take them for herself, lest we become a laughingstock. Behold, I sent the kid, but you did not find her. What do you want me to do? You want me to keep taking out ads in the newspaper that we're looking for the harlot? It's going to be a laughingstock. So let her keep the security." Okay. Now it came about after nearly 3 months, that it was told to Judah, saying, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is pregnant from harlotry." So Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burnt." she was taken out, and she sent to her father-in-law, saying, from the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please recognize whose signet, ring, cloak, and staff are these. And we mentioned last week that haker na, please recognize, is the exact same words that the brothers told their father when they showed him the garment of Judah, of Joseph dipped in the blood. Okay, then Judah recognized them, and he said, she is right. Okay, this is an interesting question. Sadka mimeni, she is right, it is from me. Literally, it could be read, Sadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me. Sadka, righteousness, mimeni, from me. So the simple interpretation is she's more righteous than me. She's right. But Rashi says, no, Sadka, she is right. Mimeni, from me. The children are from me. You could read it both ways. In any case, that's how they choose to translate here. In this one on the screen, I wonder how ArtScroll translate this. I'm just curious. So ArtScroll is going to say, she is right, it is from me. They also say like Rashi. Okay, fine. She is right, it is from me, because I did not give her to my son Shelah. But he no longer continued to be intimate with her. This is a very interesting phrase in the Torah. Lo yasaf od. If you say, he didn't do it again. Lo yasaf od. He didn't. Lo yasif is to add. He didn't add. So it happens here. It also happens at Sinai. There's two ways to read it. One side, he didn't know, he wasn't intimate with her anymore, because he didn't do it a second time. Another way is he never stopped. I mean, lo yasaf, he didn't have to do it again because he never stopped. I wonder if Rashi would say that. Does Rashi talk about this? Yeah, Rashi says this. Let's read the Rashi. It's just an interesting thing. Not he didn't do it again. Didn't do it again could be he never stopped. So in other words, that would mean he actually married Tamar, or it could mean he didn't marry Tamar. That was the end. They had the two children. That was enough. So if you look at Rashi here on 26, he no longer continued. It's not the perfect translation. No longer added. No longer added means you didn't do it again or you never stopped. So Rashi says, quotes the Medrash, Talmud. Some say he did not continue to know her, Tangomukulos, and others say he did not cease. Familiar instances found in a connection with Eldad and Medad, also with the verse states, they did not continue, which the Targum ends, they did not cease. There's a story in Numbers where you had two people who were prophesying, and Joshua was upset, and Moshe said, don't be upset. I want everyone to be prophets. The verse then says, they prophesied and they did not add. So what does that mean? It could mean they prophesied once and that's it, or they never stopped. If they never stopped, they never continued. So there's two interpretations. In any case, let's go back to what our discussion, which is the discussion of the twins. I'm just going to close down Rashi here because otherwise we'll never see anything. Hide Rashi. Okay, so we have the twins. This is what I was trying to say. Okay, so if you ask me, we don't need verse 27, 28, 29, and 30. We just need two names. But here we go. We have the story of the birth. It reminds me of my mother, who, I don't know if she still does this, but she used to do this all the time, is tell all the kids the exact story of how they were born. And my kids, should make a confession, my kids tell me, "No, how was I born? What happened?" Because I say one. And thank God I have 6 children, and I shouldn't say this. I don't always remember all of them, the exact story. But here we have the exact story of the twins. I guess if I had twins, I would have remembered. Okay, so here was the story. And it came about at the time when she was giving birth, and behold, there was twins in her womb. And it came about when she gave birth that the infant stretched out his hand. Oh, we have to know who's first. So the midwife took the band of crimson thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. She tied Shani. Shani is crimson. And she said, Zayatza Rishonah, it even rhymes. I saw a commentary this morning, okay, let's continue. 29. And it came about, and he was drawing back his hand. So you have the guy, the image here. Imagine the imagery. He's got his hand, he's got a crimson, and we know he's first. He puts his hand back. Behold, his brother emerged. So the younger one was born first. And she said, with what strength have you strengthened yourself? Lifrotz is to burst through boundaries. That's the word lifrotz, to break in a positive sense, to burst through. So the midwife says, what are you jumping? Take it easy. That's what I tell my kids. What are you jumping? You're sitting in the back seat. What are you jumping over the seats for? With what strength, ma paratza, with what strength have you burst strength, have you strengthened yourself? How do they translate into English? I wonder if it's better translation, 29. With what strength you asserted yourself. Not a perfect translation. Okay. And he called his name Peretz. Peretz is to break through. Afterwards, his brother emerged, the one upon whose hand was the crimson thread, and he named him Zerach. Zerach means to shine. Okay, wonderful, wonderful story. Is this relevant? Does this help you? Does it make your life any better to know that the younger one is first and the older one, this one burst forth? Like, what is the Torah even telling us? Like, what's the point here? What's happening here? So there's a beautiful Hasidic commentary that says like this. This is that I think that the Rebbe says this. Very, very beautiful. There's basically, we're talking about the two paths of Judah and Joseph. And we talk about the path, the person, the righteous person, and then the person who succumbs and then repents. And the Talmud itself says the person who succumbs and repents is actually greater than the person who never sinned. Why? Because he, first of all, tasted the sin and overcame it. Also, now his passion to come back to God is much more powerful. Fine. So the simple question is, so maybe I studied the Talmud, and the Talmud says that the person who sinned and returned is greater than the person who never sinned. So let me go sin. We should all have the class tomorrow morning. We should open the class next Sunday. We should meet in McDonald's. We should, God forbid, and eat something, So let's go. That's all sin. That's all sin. And then we'll repent. And we'll be ahead, because the Torah says that in the place where the Baal Teshuvah, the person who returns, stands, even the great righteous person cannot stand. So why don't we do that? So of course that's not correct, because it's like saying that a person who's from pain, you could lead to something good can come out of pain. But a normal person would not want pain. Okay, fine. So that was Judah and that was Joseph. Now look at the two sons. You have the first one. What's the first one? First one represents what the Torah wants you to do in this case. What should I do now? First, what should I do? Of course, you should seek the path of the righteous. Don't seek challenge. You wake up in the morning, we say in the prayer book, don't bring us to test. Don't bring us to test. Don't test us. We want righteousness. We don't want to be challenged. And that's the first, because that's what you should seek out. By the way, what do they name him? Zerach. What does Zerach mean? To shine. Shine represents holiness, brightness, goodness. That's the first one. That's what you should seek forth. The second one, break through boundaries, actually works both ways. It also breaks through boundaries in the negative. He goes off the positive path and goes to the negative, but also can burst back. So that is the person that represents the power to succumb and return, will be tempted and return, or succumb and return, or both. And that is only the second path, meaning that's not what you should look for in the outset. It should be, if you succumb, you should understand that there's a way to come back, and you can come back. And if you come back, you're actually going to be first. And that's what's happening. Ultimately, the person who, Peretz, the second one, comes out first, comes out ahead. He becomes the firstborn. So we need this story to show that, just like this is consistent with the entire theme of this story, but also the theme of history. And the theme of history is that there's the straightforward path of the righteous. And that's what a person, that's first. That's the first. He's the Yeshonah, he's first. And that's the one, because that's the one you should seek out for yourself first. It's only that if you were challenged and you succumbed, or you didn't succumb, you were challenged, if you were exposed to challenge, then understand that it's not that you're somehow now second class, but to the contrary. If you burst forward, you'll actually come out first. So in other words, everything we discussed about Judah and Joseph plays out with the story of Zerach and Peretz. It reminds me of the story. They say a story about Rabbi Shneur Zalman. He had a student, and the student had a child, and the child was totally not interested in Judaism or study. He only cared about his horses and horse racing. So the father managed to convince the son to come visit the Rebbe, and he says, okay, what's the Rebbe going to tell me? So the Rebbe asks him, what's better, a fast horse or a slow horse? And they get this question. He says, of course, a fast horse is better. So the Rebbe says, how come? You have a fast horse. If you make a mistake, if you go off the road, then very quickly you get lost. If you're going on a slow horse, okay, so if you make a mistake, by the time you realize you're not that far off the path, so you should prefer a slow horse. So the kid thinks for a second. He says, "No, but you don't understand, Rabbi. You should understand. With the fast horse, When you realize you made a mistake, you could turn around and come back much quicker. And of course, the Rebbe was saying that you have the passion, you have the horse, it's taking you off, but that same passion could bring you back. So that essentially is what we're saying here with Peretz. That yes, you're bursting forth and you're going in the wrong direction, but that same passion would allow you to come back and actually be back with a greater passion. And then you are ultimately the Bechor, the firstborn. And that's the imagery. The other one is first, no, but this one bursts forth first. Go ahead, Neil, please.
So going back to that Shneur Zalman story, what happened to that son?
I don't know. I hope he had.
That's a very good draft.
I hope he rode the fast. I hope he rode the fast horse. I hope he had a fast horse. That ties back to what we said in the beginning. There's no really negativity. The evil inclination. Talking about the evil inclination, a passion for sin, the same passion for sin. That's essentially neutral. Essentially, it's just a drive. People want to do what's comfortable. What people want to do what's pleasurable. But what is pleasurable for you could change. And then the person who has a great passion for sin, that great passion, if ultimately develops a taste to become close to God, then that passion is a drive to move forward and come close to Hashem. So that is the story of Judah versus Joseph, but it plays out in the stories of Zerach and Peretz, maybe even highlighting or justifying what happened to Judah. Peretz is the story of Judah. He didn't make the right choices in the beginning, but ultimately he comes out ahead because this union, which seems to be in Judah's intention, certainly it was not holy, yet that union ultimately brings forth the redemption of the people, first in the times of David, and then in the future redemption. So what does that tell you? That tells you not because they didn't sin, not because David didn't sin, or the lineage, anyone in the lineage didn't sin, but that's not the criteria. The criteria is we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for people who could develop and grow from the failure. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Clearly, this is not the first time in Genesis where the eldest is not the protagonist.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I think it's almost following a pattern.
Right.
What I don't understand is that the greatest person in the 5 books is Moshe, and yet we're not talking about the Mosaic dynasty.
Yeah, so that's very interesting.
Here we have Judah, who by accident or by fiat becomes the leader of the Judaic dynasty. So I'm confused by that. I think, Rabbi Sachs alluded to this by saying that dynasties in monarchy can be, family oriented, but when it comes to Ruach HaKodesh, that becomes different.
Yeah, especially. First of all, I'm glad you mentioned it because last week's parsha, yesterday's parsha was Moshe asking God to select a leader, and he selects Joshua. The Medrash says that Moshe was a little bit disappointed because Moshe hoped that his sons would be selected, and the reality is that Joshua was selected. Especially when it comes to scholarship, then what is Moshe? He's a prophet, but he's also our teacher. Moshe is the conveyor of the Torah. When it comes to Torah, the ethics of the father says you have to prepare yourself to study Torah because it's not a Yerusha, it's not an inheritance. To become a scholar, to become a leader in the arena of knowledge, you have to put in the time. And the Rashi quotes the Rashi quotes the Medrash, which quotes the verse, Notzer teina yochal pirya. The person who guards the date tree will eat the fruit. You want to eat the fruit, you have to put in the time. To water the tree, you have to let it grow. And the point here is, if you want, about Joshua, because Joshua says he was Moshe's servant. Lo yamish mitoch ha'oel. He never left Moshe's tent. Never left Moshe's tent. He didn't go on vacation. The sons after the lecture they went home, right? Joshua never left Moshe's tent. So he was the most devoted to the teachings, and therefore he had that advantage. And Joshua's children also did not succeed. That's the point. When it comes to Torah, there's no lineage whatsoever. It's all about It's all about who is going to be devoted. Maimonides talks about this in the beginning of his in laws of Talmud Torah, laws of study of Torah, and he says basically there are three ktarim, there are three crowns. In other words, there's three ways of maintaining, of receiving greatness in Judaism. There's Keter Kahuna, the crown of priesthood. There's Keter Malchut, there's the crown of kingship, and there's Keter Torah, the crown of Torah. Later he's going to say the crown of Torah is the greatest. So he says, well, the first two are not accessible to all. Priesthood, must be the descendants of Aaron. Monarchy, well, you could be a king, but if you want to be part of the dynasty is the descendants of Judah. But he says the crown of Torah is sitting on the side in the corner, accessible to anybody who wants to take it. Right? And you want to do it. You got to invest the time. And that's why if you look at our history, some of the greatest sages were converts. Some of the greatest sages grew up as ignoramuses and descendants of converts, because it has nothing to do with lineage. And the first place to see that, we see that in yesterday's parsha. So I think that a dynasty is a little bit different. That kingship is a little bit different than that. There is room for you need to build on the previous generations. But the question is, what is the ethos of this family? What does this dynasty tell you? What's our story? So if it would be the descendants of Rachel, the stories we tell about ourselves, we're good people. You can't really find a serious flaw in the descendants of Rachel or in Saul in the beginning of the story until he turns. Like I said, the problem with perfection is that when you fail, you don't know how to fix it. People say, I have a bad relationship because I saw my parents fight. But I know people who say that I have a problem because I never saw my parents fight. So I never saw them reconcile. So now when I have a problem with my spouse, I have no idea how to reconcile, because you don't have that example in your story. You don't have that example in your family. So when Saul ultimately is faced with the challenge of David, he doesn't know what to do. He can't correct. So he's perfect. He's perfect until he crashes, right? So that's the dynasty. If you had the dynasty from Saul, but now that you have the dynasty from David, so what's our story? Our story is not the story of people don't fail. Going way back to our origin, we fail all the time. Black on white, we read it every year in the Torah. No one's going to forget about it, right? But the point here is that's not the point. The point is not that you fail. The point is, what do you do when you fail? What do you do when you're challenged? And that's the dynasty. And that's the dynasty. That's the story that we pass on from generation to generation. We want that continuity of stories and of tradition to be the foundation of this dynasty. But Torah leadership, Torah scholarship, it's nothing to do. Your father can't help you. The knowledge has to be acquired. The knowledge has to be, you have to invest the time. You have to guard the date if you want to consume its fruits. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. A lot more to say about this story and about the other stories. We'll see next week if we go back to this or we continue, see what happens. But in any case, have a wonderful day and thank you for joining. And this has been a lot of fun, at least for me. So thank you for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.